Hi, welcome to week 4, the final week of this course. For those of you who are still with me, congratulations, you've done really well getting this far. I know it's been very intense, but I hope you feel like you've gotten something out of this. This is the only lecture for this week. You've just got one quiz about commas and then a practice exam and a final exam, and it's going to be a little different this time, basically because I basically have to give you a structure and of how you do the work, so you can do the quiz, watch this lecture and do the quiz and the practice practice exam on Monday and Tuesday, and then Wednesday is the designated exam day. So you've got 2 days to complete 2 tasks, and then the exam is on Wednesday. The practice exam doesn't count. It's purely practice. If you do it, you'll know what the final exam is like, and you'll see that it will be very clear what will be new in the final exam and what will be old. Basically, the instructions will be the same for the practice exam and the final exam, but the things that you have to apply the instructions to, let's say, will be different. So that's how we're going to do it. Anyway, before we get to that, there's one more big topic that I have to introduce in order for me to feel like I've done my job as a teacher of grammar, and that's talk about commas. Commas are I would say, the most tricky and the most important form of punctuation. What I'm going to tell you about today is nothing like you can't put a comma here, you can't put a comma there. I'm only going to tell you where commas can go. The rest is up to you figuring out where they can't go. Okay, let's start then. So, comma use allows for more sophisticated writing because it separates independent clauses from everything that modifies them, and also separates nouns from some of the things that modify them. The last line that I've written here is sort of fancy. It says, commas give grammatical contours to sentences. They're a little bit like signposts, and I think you've seen that, especially in your second assignment. You were using commas to identify boundaries between clauses and modifiers and other things like that. So by using commas, you show a certain level of sophistication in an understanding about how your work is structured grammatically. It gives your reader some geography, a map, if you like, to navigate your prose with. So let's have a look where people use commas. They've got 5 functions, and as I mentioned before, there are some books, some grammar books, you might see this, that give you a list of lots and lots of places where people commonly misuse commas, or where commas can't be. I'm not going to talk about that. I think that's counterproductive. I don't think you can teach very well by telling everyone what not to do. Instead, I'm going to give you this list. You should be pretty familiar with all the terminology in the list, so that when you're writing, you think, is the place where I want to put a comma one of these 5 environments, or if I've just created something that fits one of these descriptions, should there be a comma there? So that's how I want you to approach it, in a productive way rather than a corrective way. Though clearly you can use all these points in a corrective way as well. So, what are they actually for? You want to know that? So commas have 5 functions. Firstly, as we've seen, separating a modifier from its clause, or a noun from its modifier if the modifier is non-restrictive. So if the modifier is non-essential to the meaning of the noun. So one of the quizzes you saw, including the American comma John Yettow comma, that giving the name was a modifier that wasn't necessarily essential, but it helped to identify who the writer was writing about. So the 2 commas set off that the extra modification. We'll see some more examples in a minute. Between 2 independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction. We've been seeing this for the last 3 weeks, so that's no surprise. To separate a dependent clause from an independent clause, once again, no surprise there, but very important. Between items in a list, we haven't seen that before, and to separate a causal object from the verb that introduces it. We've also seen that when you were working on introducing quotations. So all in all, there's only one thing that's unfamiliar. All the rest of these things you've been working with before. So let's look at the first type. I've taken all the examples from your reading from week 3. I spelled Jhumpa Lahiri's name wrong. It's Jhumpa. I always do that. My apologies. So let's take a look, first of all, at a noun phrase being modified by a non-restrictive relative clause. So this is one of these non-essential modifiers. So I put the noun in blue. A yellow volume of lyrics by the poet Qazi Nazrul Islam. This is a pretty complex noun phrase, but you see it's got its head noun is volume, and it's got 2 sort of prepositional phrases modifying it and an adjective. And then we have a non-restrictive relative clause, which tells us more about the book, but doesn't necessarily, we don't need it to identify what she's talking about. And that non-restrictive relative clause is separated by two commas, one before and one after. So if you see, and the which tells us it's a relative clause, but the comma goes before the which and then after the relative clause. So there's lots of these. I gave you one example when talking in the slide before. Here's another one. So you'll see a number of these in the writing that you look at. These ones are more common. These are the sentence modifiers separated from the clause that they modify by a comma. So the first one we see is a prepositional phrase, starts with at, which is a preposition. So at one point, comma, right? And then we start the independent clause. You've looked at these before, right? Nothing surprising here. The second sentence, the sentence modifier occurs after the independent clause. It's, as you see, a present participial phrase, and so we put the comma before the present participle, so encountering fictional worlds as if physically. And the last one is a dependent clause. So I'm cheating a bit here. I have another slide for dependent clauses, but we see comma as there was to certain other aspects of our material lives. So lots of different kinds of sentence modifiers. If the modifier goes before the independent clause, the comma goes after the modifier. If the modifier comes after the independent clause, the comma goes before it. Pretty simple, but what we see is there are commas throughout. Like the places where the commas occur are predictable. The second place that we'll see commas occurring is between 2 independent clauses, which are joined by a coordinating conjunction. So you saw this before, but I'm going to go through it again using this quite complex example from Lahiri's essay to show you how it works. The comma goes at the end of the first clause before the coordinating conjunction. So we can see it here. The comma, coordinating conjunction. This is actually a really complex sentence and has many coordinating conjunctions in it, and the coordinating conjunctions actually are embedded within a dependent clause, but that's not particularly relevant. We can see we've got a clause here, perhaps because he believed in collective property. We know it's dependent because of this because. And then we've got another repetition. We've got or perhaps, so another coordinating conjunction with a comma before it. And then we've got another one, same form again. So you can see that she's following this pattern of repetition. But in each case, she includes the comma before the or the and. So canonical use of the coordinating conjunction goes with the comma rule. This is a really nice example, I think. Down here, by the way, is the dependent clause that supports all of these independent. I'll say that the right way around. Down here is the independent clause that supports all these dependent clauses up here. The third type is to separate a dependent clause from the following independent clause. We saw this sort of thing before. When I began to make friends, writing was the vehicle. So we see the subordinated conjunction at the beginning, making that first clause dependent. After the whole clause, right before the beginning of the independent clause, we put a comma. No problem, right? The comma isn't always necessary when the order's reversed. So I've got two examples here, one that I've taken straight from Lahiri. How could I want to be a writer to articulate what was within me when I did not wish to be myself? So there is a comma before the when here, but we also see that there's something that intervenes between the independent clause and the dependent clause, this little phrase, to articulate what was within me. That's actually I would say that that's an additional verb phrase because it's a parallel structure with what's in the independent clause. So we can see, how could I want to be a writer? And we could repeat the how could I want to be a writer? How could I want to articulate what was within me? So this to articulate is actually part of the verb phrase, and you can do that. You can repeat parts as long as there's some kind of parallelism. If you're going to separate two things like this with a comma, as we'll see on the next slide, they need to be of the same type. So you can see we've got the two twos, TOs here. That means it's a parallelism. You separate the two of them with a comma, and Bob's your uncle. Here, we also, Lahiri finishes the sentence with a dependent clause. So we're setting that to articulate what was within me is not essential to the meaning of the sentence. It's just an elaboration. So it's set off, just like the non-restrictive relative clause, with two commas, one before the elaboration, one after. So this example here, that second to last bullet point, actually has a lot of stuff going on in it that reflects what we've seen. I've adapted it in the last bullet point. Oh, look, I made the thing pop up. I've adapted it in the last bullet point to leave out that parenthetical non-essential thing. And you can see that I've left out the comma as well, because when you have the dependent clause and the independent clause in this order, that is independent clause first, dependent clause second, you don't need that comma. And you saw that a lot in one of the quizzes that you did in week 2. There were a lot of senses in it, and almost everyone missed the senses as because there was no comma, but they were in fact dependent clauses. So here are the lists. I thought this was a juicy list, and in fact we see it's got this parallel structure going on again. So fiction is a deliberate act of willfulness, a deliberate effort to reconceive, to rearrange, to reconstitute, nothing short of reality itself. So this repetition of the same kinds of grammatical element, each separate one is set off with a comma. So we see that the second to, TO, and the third to, TO, is preceded by a comma. So between each element of the list is a comma, and that the list can be phrases like it is here. It can also be words. So I can say, I chose cheese, chips, and apples, and those cheese, chips, and apples would have commas between them too. So this is pretty simple. What you've just got to be careful of is that the things that you think should be separated by commas are of the same category. Otherwise, you have to do something fancier. So in this final example, we see something that you've seen before as well. The commas used to separate causal objects from the verbs that introduce them. You've been working on doing this yourself, doing your quotations correctly in assignment number 3. So what we see here is that being a writer means taking the leap from listening to saying, listen to me. Lahiri wrote this. She provided me everything that I needed. We have the comma right here, and then we have the independent clause, which forms the object of this verb of saying or showing, which is in fact saying. So, we read over these. We don't pause. Sometimes people talk about commas as being a place where you pause. We don't pause with this kind of comma, but it's a grammatical necessity. So what you see here is verb of saying or showing, comma, quotation, period, etc., etc. Okay, so to recap this, to get a look at some more examples, you'll need to read the relevant sections of your text from page 42, I think, onwards. There's quite a lot of detail in your textbook about commas. Then do quiz number 10, and finally After you've gotten everything and taken a deep breath, you do the practice exam, and once again, the final exam will be available on Wednesday.